Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Stream's Open Editorial. And today we're tackling a pretty big subject, institutionalized racism in the U.S. There is a mouthful for you, so let me break that down for you, for everyone joining us from the world of the internet, those of you joining us via Twitter, watching us on Google Hangout. If you've seen our tweets, you've seen the hashtag we're using for this conversation is still segregated. And what we're doing is reaching out to you, followers, viewers, our audience, and we're trying to pick your brains to get the stories that you think that are underreported, undercovered, that have to deal with segregation in the U.S. and how it affects communities and everyday lives here in the United States. And so that's what we are going to try to do today over the next 35 minutes or so. It's going to be a lot to pack into a half an hour, but all of the ideas that we come up with here today via Twitter, the ones you guys send us on Twitter, and the ones that we're going to hear from our panelists in our Google Hangout, we're hoping to turn those ideas into coverage, into show topics for the stream in the future. So our open editorials are always a really good source of information. We mine these great ideas, and then we hope to do really great things with it with your input. So without further ado, let's get started. And just a reminder, you can follow along with this conversation by, if you're on Twitter, by watching that hashtag still segregated, and you can see it behind me. So I'm going to let our guests introduce you in our virtual round table, and they will introduce themselves, excuse me. So let's start in New Orleans with Terry. Terry, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Terry Coleman. I am an instructor, an English instructor at Dillard University, a small historically black college. I'm also an HBCU alum and a black academic who does lots of things with race and academia.
And I got to say that this is the second time, but Terry was the first use of that I had heard of the term blackademic, and I love it now, and I've been using it, so thank you for educating me. Yes, you do. All right, so that's Terry Coleman. Let's head over to Milwaukee. Angela?
Hey, I'm Angela Walker, and I am the Community Campaigns Coordinator for Wisconsin Jobs Now, fighting for education justice, economic justice, as pieces of lifting our city out of generational segregation and generational poverty.
Deep. I can't wait to hear more on that and how you do that. Let's move over to Los Angeles. Melina.
Hey, I'm still in that blackademic. I'm Ali Abdullah. I'm professor and chair of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA, and I'm also an organizer with Black Lives Matter. And since we got our HBCU hats on, I'm a Howard alumna, so yeah, we all down. Yeah.
And just for our international audience, let me clue you in on what an HBCU is. That's a historically black college or university, and we're going to delve into more about education in our open editorial today, so you'll hear more about that topic. So last but not least, right here in Washington, D.C., Tracy.
Hi, I'm Tracy Ross. I am the Associate Director of the Poverty to Prosperity program at the Center for American Progress. Basically, my job is looking at the fact that your zip code impacts your life outcomes. And I'm a proud, former resident of Oakland. It's my hometown.
Nice, awesome. Well, welcome. And since we're shouting out hometowns, I will say that my hometown is Chicago, Illinois, which I dared to say, and I tell people that it is the most segregated city in the country. But as I was reading the notes for our guests here today, I would say pretty much everyone believes that they are from the most segregated city in the country. So let's start with Milwaukee. Let's start with housing. That's where we're going to open up this conversation. Housing. Are there differences in predominantly black neighborhoods versus predominantly white neighborhoods where you are in Milwaukee? Help elucidate that for an international audience, because do remember that is who our audience is, and so people may not always be familiar with the dynamics of what an American city might look like. Let's go straight to Milwaukee.
Okay, when we're talking about the segregation here in Milwaukee, you're talking about literally black and brown folks in the central city, and we are surrounded by very, very white suburbs. It's very, very visible, the segregation that we have here, and I think that we actually are, if not the most segregated city in the country, we're number 2. And it's very, very visible. I mean, you have predominant, the concentrations of black and brown people in 53206 in certain zip codes, and the further out you go, the whiter it gets. So I mean, we are hyper segregated here, and it is completely by design.
Mm. And so by design, all right, so then that leads me to people watching. They may wonder what the historical context for this is, not just in Milwaukee, but other places, because like I said, I would say the same thing for Chicago, and even DC, where I'm now a resident. Anyone want to pick up on that historical context that might lead to what we are seeing today?
Sure, I'll jump in. So, I think a lot of people have heard the term, or hopefully have heard the term, redlining. So in the 1930s, redlining was a practice that really started where you saw the federal government essentially sponsoring white families and investing in the strength of white communities, while at the same time denying African Americans access to these more affluent communities, denying them access to home loans. And these are the sorts of things that we saw over time through a variety of federal programs. In the 1950s, we saw the expansion of the highway system in this country that often rammed through Black and brown neighborhoods, destroying businesses and communities in the process. So essentially, any time that we've expanded or tried to invest in our country, it has been at the detriment of Black and brown communities. And even when we were doing programs in the 50s and 60s, such as urban renewal, which sounds positive, sounds like we're going to be doing something good for high poverty communities and communities of color, it actually just gave local leaders the free rein to develop downtowns and reconcentrate poverty in high-rise public housing towers. So we see that this really is absolutely by design.
Yeah, if I could just pick up on that, there's the redlining issue, and then there's also 3 other ways in which communities have been racially segregated. So we have racial zoning ordinances, we have restrictive covenants, which literally forbode people, white folks, from selling their homes to Black folks, right? And then we have racialized public housing. So we have this historical context, but I think that it's really important that we also think about, so my mother is from the segregated South, and the racial component of segregation is hugely important, but when we couple that with the economic component, when we think about contemporary segregation, it's not just Black people living in particular neighborhoods. If we think about what was happening in places like Los Angeles in the 1950s, 40s, 60s, I know I went out of order there, right? There were lots of Black folks who were moving to Los Angeles to get really good working class jobs. So people settled in places like Watts and worked in factories and made enough money to support their families and to send their children to school. What's happened now is kind of this hyper capitalism that is not just it's a racialized economic oppression. So in that same community in Watts, if we think about where there used to be this strip of really good union jobs where Black people could do well, and the Black people who weren't doing so well lived next to Black people who were doing well, so they benefited from each other, and there was this whole like cultural expression that came about, right? So if we think about Central Avenue, if we think about, the Watts Towers and the Watts Arts movement, all of that was there. That has changed now because it's also this ability, so you have these racialized communities that are now economically depressed. Those good jobs have gone away, and so folks are poor in these communities, and that sets the communities up for really an occupation. And so what we see in communities like Watts, even communities like Skid Row, a lot of the Watts folks have been moved north up to Skid Row. You see them being preyed upon by police, by a prison industrial complex, by hyper-exploitation in the workforce. And so these are the kinds of new patterns of segregation that we're seeing. So it's important that we have the historic context and understand how it set it up for the system to be what it is, where you have a Skid Row population in Los Angeles that is almost 70% Black.
So I'm actually glad you raised that, because then that might lead some people to say, well, then reintegration of some of these cities, the reversal of what I guess you could call white flight, or what you do call white flight, which is what happened in the 50s and the 60s, as you were mentioning, even the 70s in some places, where white families were encouraged to move to the suburbs and out of the cities, and these cities became areas of blight, really, because banks wouldn't lend, businesses closed. So you then have people saying, well, what about reintegrating these cities? And so I'm pulling up a tweet here. This is from Brent Williams Smith. This is someone tweeted us in our Twitter chat a little bit earlier using that hashtag still segregated. He says, cities shaped by people of color are under assault. And he uses Detroit as the example. As white populations increase, Native blacks are being profiled. And so he seems to say that that is not then the answer. Reintegration and just making sure there's an equal amount of black and white isn't the answer, because it doesn't happen that way. And Terry, I saw that you responded to his tweet, because I know you have something to say about that.
Cool. So I responded to his tweet because New Orleans right now is kind of a case study in contemporarily happening in this moment, that kind of pattern where all of the historical things have set it up. So we have impoverished communities that are predominantly communities of color and marginalized communities. And in New Orleans, we had a storm. We had Katrina, which a lot of people have talked about as wiping the slate clean. So what it did was it erased a lot of people. It meant poor people couldn't come back. The actual housing stock was gone. And what we have happening now in New Orleans is urban renewal, urban revitalization, gentrification, where increasingly white people and people who are more well off from other places, not from Southern Louisiana, not from the region, so they also don't have the kind of cultural connections to our city that white native New Orleanians have. They come in, and for a minute, there's this magical moment of integration and diversity, where what had been a homogeneously black community or a homogeneously brown community, a homogeneously poor community, has diversity, because there's white folks and there's well-off folks and there's middle class people with what had been concentrated black and brown poverty. But that only lasts for a second, because property values rise, because more people with means come in, and the end result is the original homogeneous population gets displaced and replaced by a new homogeneous segregated population. So we go from predominantly black and brown, predominantly poor, to a mixed moment, which is like the magical kumbaya second, and then it actually ends up turning into a new kind of segregated community, where not only is it segregated, but it's exclusive and no longer it's not that people don't want to live there, right? Like it's not that white folks didn't want to move to the ghetto. Instead, it's that people who came from the ghetto can no longer call their homes home because white folks have taken over.
Yeah, and I'd love to just add on to that, because I think all of us have been talking a lot about the low-income aspect to all of this. But one of my favorite sociologists, I quote from a lot, Patrick Sharkey from NYU, has found that the average African-American family making $100,000 a year lives in a more disadvantaged neighborhood than the average white family making only $30,000 a year.
That is shocking to me.
It's absolutely shocking. And I think we don't realize that, I think it was Melina who was saying earlier that, black families have always lived near other black professionals and that sort of thing. We're used to having these sorts of strong black communities, and because wealth is often tied up in your home, and you pass this down to the next generation. Racism has really trapped black people of all incomes in these neighborhoods. So I think everyone has made this point, but I just wanted to call it out vocally, and just make it clear that 70% of the black people who live in the most disadvantaged communities in our country are the grandchildren and children of those who lived in them, in the 50s. So this is a multi-generational problem. It's a multi-income problem, because it really is about intentionally having black people in certain neighborhoods and white people having the perception, even if it's not, them being malicious, if they're just out house hunting and want to find a nice neighborhood, if you see black people, they often perceive that it's a bad neighborhood, even if it's got a lot of black middle class people in it.
Yeah,
I think too, like my family's personal history kind of ties back into that too. Like my grandfather on my dad's side, they were all military. That whole generation was military. So the first generation of black people who could have access to being officers in the military. And this is, this is people who went and fought and died in Europe. These are people who went to France and got treated like humans and came back to the American South and got called boy. My grandfather was an officer, lived abroad, came back and had to live in a segregated neighborhood, Pontchartrain Park. That meant his house was worth less. That meant my dad's generation had different access to school or lack of access to certain types of schools. All of that ties into why I, as a child of people with multiple degrees, grew up bottom middle class when my white classmates with comparable personal family histories were going to France for vacation in the summer.
Right.
Because intergenerationally it's robbed.
I think it's also important, though, that we look at the other side of that, because what we've been trained to do, if people take that argument too far, is to think that it's better to look for communities that are not traditionally black. And when we do that, and we saw this happen in the 80s and 90s, black people moving out to suburban areas thinking that they're better, right? And then ultimately the folks who moved way out, they lost the most in terms of property value, right? So they moved all the way out to these suburbs like here in the Los Angeles area, Lancaster and the Inland Empire. And then when the housing market tanked, they lost almost everything, right? But we lost something more than that, because what starts to happen is we lose the cultural value of black communities. And so that we need to start to reimagine how we create value. We need to stop allowing the real estate market to dictate value exclusively, right? We need to think about what the cultural capital is of communities, and really think about what residential patterns and closely tied black communities mean in terms of both cultural value but also political power. So one of the things that we're also seeing is, how does this translate into political power when black people kind of disperse from neighborhoods that are traditionally ours, right? So we're not able to elect black people to office, or the black people who are elected to office kind of advance themselves according to a racially neutral identity, saying that I am a politician who happens to be black, I don't just represent black people. And so we need to really kind of engage in these critical conversations about how residential patterns translate into political power and cultural capital.
Hey, Angela, I saw you nodding your head. I just want to spend a couple more minutes on housing before we move on to education, but I saw you nodding your head there, and I know that you tried to do just that because you tried to run for sheriff, correctly? So talk to us about what was happening in Milwaukee that you then felt, I got to do something.
Milwaukee is ground zero for segregation. We're ground zero, especially the zip code that I live in, 53206. I'm resonating with everything everyone on the panel is saying about being that grandchild of folks who witnessed deindustrialization, who had those union jobs and have that house, and you're one of the last homeowners in the neighborhood, and watching all of these things happen around you and trying to hold on to some sense of community when folks are moving in that have no sense of that, and that's not their history. So I'm resonating with everything everyone else is saying. But I ran for sheriff because we're not talking about poverty. If we want to be serious about what's happening as far as the crime levels here in Milwaukee County particularly, let us look at very squarely at poverty and call out capitalism and its effect on racial relations and its effect on economics that are leading to the things that are happening. I mean, most of the folks that are being locked up and racially profiled here are being done for nonviolent offenses and nonviolent marijuana-related offenses. And so, I mean, we're locking people up for something that's legal in other states. And the sheriff's role here is primarily administrative. So it's not like he's a street cop, even though he tries to portray himself as one. But I'm going to leave that alone. But it's primarily administrative, and he has a platform where he can talk about really getting at the root problems and root causes of crime here. And I felt that was not being done, so I ran as a socialist.
And you got how much of the vote before we move on?
20%.
Congratulations.
That's
20%. Yeah. Okay, so I do want to move on now to education because a lot of what we talked about with housing plays a role into education. Where you are zoned for living, where you grow up, then determines what school district you can apply to, what school district your kids get to go to. Terry, I know you're a mother. Start us off.
Well, so I guess to understand like my take on integration and segregation in schooling, it's really important to look at New Orleans in particular. New Orleans, again, because of the storm, is one, if not the first, I think the first, but maybe just one of the first. We no longer have public schools. We have an all charter system. And what that means is instead of having a central school board that has like most American cities work, where there's like, I don't like, there's a school board who decides what schooling is like for that district, for that community. We have charters where private entities, sometimes not for profit. We also have a system where where religious institutions can get a charter to get public money. But all of our schools are run by a charter system. So as a parent, that means when I try to put my kid into school, I have 2 school-age children, a kindergartner and a second grader. There's no community school. There is no more neighborhood schooling. That does not exist here. Instead, I have to fill out an application called a One App that has 50% of the schools that are an option, but then all of the good charter schools, and these are the ones that some of them are holdovers from before the storm that were predominantly white, mostly, that were funded differently, that were magnet schools, that were eked out from the system. Those all have their own separate application systems. And it ends up being, it's just a super messed up system, and it ends up with things like, it reinforces all of the kind of marginalization that already exists. So for some of the better charter schools, for example, you have to put your application for your kid, you have to bring it to the school. Doesn't seem like a big deal. If you live across town and you take the bus, you can't get to that school between 9 to 5. We don't have a good public transportation system. So there's all these ways set up for you if you're already marginalized, usually in terms of race and class, to not have access to quality schooling. And the end result inside the schools in the city is that the schools are super, super segregated. There are schools that are almost all black. There are no schools that are all white, but in a city that is this heavily black and brown, when you have schools that are 80% white, that should tell you something.
What about the rest of you? Did you grow up in predominantly any one race or ethnicity schools? What was your own schooling journey like?
Well, we have a charter school system in Los Angeles. I'm going to talk about my children because I'm old. We have a charter school system in Los Angeles, but we also have a public school system that is really fueled by this magnet school process. So you apply, all of the regular LAUSD schools are pretty bad, but there are great magnet schools. And so you have to apply to this magnet school system. And there's a point system, so you got to get rejected. There's this whole game that you play. So I've been really fortunate in getting my children into a wonderful magnet school. I have a 7th, 4th, and should be kindergartner. And they're in great magnet schools. But I think about the amount of work that goes into figuring out the system and how much you need in terms of resource to be able to do that. And it means that people who are not as connected and who don't have conversations with upwardly mobile parents and who may have crunches on their time, they don't get their children into the school. So what we're left with is these kind of shells of schools that are LAUSD non-magnet schools that black folks and brown folks go to. And I don't remember the exact number, but I know that it's more than 50% of black and brown students go to schools that are more than 50% black and brown. Or it's higher than that. It's more like 70%, but I don't remember the statistic. So what you're left with is like these really impoverished schools. So one of the high schools in south of Los Angeles has a majority of students, for instance, that come from DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services. They're foster care children because their foster parents aren't going to try and seek out the magnet schools, right? And so we need to really kind of rethink how residential patterns play in. but also how we are deliberately setting up school systems that are segregated. And as we move towards not for-profit schools, you'll see more and more of this.
So a couple of thoughts popped up while they were both talking, because everything they said I think was absolutely spot on. But I started thinking about the charter schools in particular, because I think that a lot of people are really attracted to the idea of charter schools, and there's a lot of education reformers who are almost like celebrities in the education policy world. And I have a lot of good friends who are principals and of charter schools, and they'll be the first to say that charter schools perform at or worse than public schools. And more often than not, when we're seeing the kind of, I guess, takeover of charter schools, it is in communities of color. And so it looks like, oh wow, something wonderful is coming to our communities, when really it's an experiment that is far from perfect. It has not yet been perfected. And so we can't just think of that as the panacea to our education problems. So I just wanted to throw that out there. But another thing that I saw recently, it was in the Washington Post. There was a study about just this area in Florida where the title of the article was something to the effect of we didn't know that they were geniuses. And it was all about how the school system just didn't really look at the predominantly black schools to test them for if they would be qualified for the gifted program. And once they would finally decide, let's test all the second graders in the entire school district, there was an 80% increase in the number of black students that were deemed gifted. And it's just, we're ignoring our communities just from the outset. Even though there is an achievement gap, we're assuming that achievement gap very early and aren't even paying attention to the kids who are doing well right now.
And this is everyone's got something to say. Go ahead, Angela.
Well, I mean, we're facing what we're fighting right now. This evening, there is a public hearing where they may or may not take up the issue of a two-tier system being set up in one of our high schools. And I'd like to personally apologize to New Orleans because your voucher system is based on this foolishness that they enacted here. So I apologize for that happening to y'all. But the state takeover of our schools was written into our state budget and passed in the middle of the night. So we're looking at our county executive being given the authority to appoint a commissioner who will siphon off 3 to 5 schools to hand over to the state. And we've told them, you're not getting not one school, not one kid. You can legislate what you like, see if you get it. But we're dealing with nothing less than the colonization of black and brown children. If this experiment, and you were absolutely spot on with that, Tracy, if this experiment was so worthwhile and so intelligent and so innovative, why is it not being done in more affluent white areas? Why is this only directed at black and brown children whose parents and communities have no idea what's being foisted on them, and that there is a difference in these types of schools, and that they need to be asking questions? When these parents are working 3 and 4 jobs, they're exhausted, they're tired, they don't know to go into the school because they don't feel welcome. They're not asking questions about what's being offered to them. So when their child infracts in a charter or a voucher school and is pushed back to an underfunded public school, they have no idea that this is all part of a very, very big scheme that's nationwide, that's worldwide, and it is aimed at the commodification of black and brown children. And that's all this is. It's never about education. This is about money, and people need to put that on the table.
Well, I think too, it's important to push back a little bit, because you said, I agree with you, Angela, that like there's a lot of, in these communities, people don't know. But also, it's such an effective system that even when we know, we cannot push back. Like in New Orleans, if you want your kids to go to some of the good magnet schools, you have to get them tested, blah, 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 to get the gifted thing. And the state will pay for testing. We took off work, went to the West Bank, brought my son for the testing. He got like three points below on the matrix for where he could be gifted, which would have put him into a much better school. And this is pre-K, and we don't have universal pre-K, so this is a huge deal. The woman at the testing office straight up told me to my face, if I had hired a private tester, they would have said he was gifted. If I had $450, my baby would have gone to one of the best pre-K 4s in the state. It's not even that we just don't know. sometimes we know the rules of the game and we cannot play it because it has been set up for us to fail.
Right.
I want to just interject really quickly here because there's a tweet here that I want to read from our community members who are listening to our hangout here, and they're still tweeting in. So this is Shani, and she's sharing her own perspective. She's from Charleston. She writes, Academic Magnet High School here in Charleston has 12 black students out of, get this, 600. It wasn't that way 15 years ago. It's tied to the economy and blindered board hashtag still segregated. So I want to pivot just a little bit because I promised our audience that we would talk about this as a potential solution, and I want to get your thoughts on it. HBCUs, self-segregated, but minority segregations that some might believe need to happen, and HBCUs for our audience is a refresher memory, historically black colleges and universities. I think 2 members of our guests here said that they went to HBCUs. Is that true?
Yeah, I went to Howard, and I'm also the child of HBCU graduates. My mother went to Spelman, and my dad went to Morehouse. And I think it's hugely important that we think about, and I think this was kind of an earlier point that I want to lift up, is that all segregation isn't bad, right? All the decisions that we make to be with our own folks are not bad decisions when we have the power to actually do that, right? So we can make those decisions. When I went to Howard, you know, it was, in any HBCU grad will tell you, like, the first conversation, you'll know where they went to school because it's part of what makes us who we are, right? We learn about ourselves. We learn about not just that we're black, but what kind of black people we are, right? We learn about our legacy and our power and our ability to make change. We have agency. We don't just have to accept what's heaped upon us. And so that's what we get from going to an HBCU. I teach now at a Hispanic serving institution. And we get less of that here because there's not the same historic background. But within my department, within Pan-African Studies, we try to kind of bring some of that HBCU experience to the students that we have here, and it translates into huge success rates. So there was a study that Black Enterprise did some years ago where they looked at black college students, and what they found is that there was no white institution that had a 50% or higher graduation rate for its black students. But there were, I think, almost no, I don't think there was a single one, HBCU that had a lower than 50% graduation rate for its students. That translates here. My institution has a horrible graduation rate for its black students overall, but within Pan-African Studies, we have a 100% graduation rate.
Wow.
And that's unheard of, but it's because of all of the work that we do. So when we talk about segregation, I think we need to talk about both voluntary segregation, the spaces where we need to kind of create safe spaces for ourselves sometimes, and I'm going to just be straight up, sometimes I just don't want to see white folks, right? Sometimes I just need to be with my folks, my family, and, you know, not have to explain stuff, right?
I have a white husband, and sometimes I don't want to hang out with white people. I've been reading 20 Morris and the Bluest Eye. We can't hang out right now, white husband. I'm sorry.
Exactly.
That's interesting that because I do want you to remind you, this is an international audience, so I'm sure there might be people, and I'm not even going to name countries because they're from all over, but who might hear that and think, oh, that's racist.
I think it's
what would you tell
to
them?
make a distinction, though, between there's segregation from the outside, segregation that says we will not let you in, which is what Jim Crow segregation was and what a lot of the holdover is. And then there's segregation as an intervention in those white supremacist systems. Yes. So HBCUs are actually an intervention in a white supremacist system. As an American, I'm constantly walking through whiteness. I'm drowning in it. It is suffocating me. It's in my language, it's in the air, it's in the makeup of my cities. I had to get it at every moment in my education. So it's not as if I'm ignorant of it and I haven't learned it and I haven't even the choice not to participate in it. What identity-based schooling does is it allows for a schooling model that says, hey, you students are particular. You are not universal. Who and what are you? Who and what are your needs? Let's talk to that. And you see the same model in women's colleges. Those are an intervention in patriarchal systems. Religious schooling. So you look at Catholic schools.
I went to an all-Muslim school when I grew up.
Yeah, that's an intervention in the kind of normativity of another system of power. And if you look at in a larger colonial mindset, if you look at If you look at Kenya, the community-based schools, the Kikuyu schools that existed before the British government forced colonial schooling in English, there's a difference in how those systems of education work, and we know across the board, we have a million studies from all these different fields that say when children and adult humans who are learning understand their place in the world, when they can see themselves as valuable, when they can believe that they can learn, they will. And that's what community-based segregated schooling does, which is very different from what top-down white power segregation schooling does.
Right. So it's voluntary as opposed to imposed segregation.
Right.
My mother went to imposed segregated schools. So we need places for retreat. That's what our communities provide. That's what our HBCUs provide. But it's not the same as an imposed segregation that is heaped upon us by a power system that's really doing it for its own gain and our oppression.
Right. Well said. I want to jump in there just because we're running out of time, but I will go to you next. Who was that? Was that was that Tracy?
That was Angela.
That was Angela. All right, Angela, I'm going to start with you for this next section then, because I do want to parlay this conversation on education into then how does that affect what happens after you leave school and jobs and your whole entire economic system? And I know that's a huge topic that I'm now going to squeeze into a few minutes, but I'm interested in your thoughts on the do's and don'ts of covering that issue as it pertains to segregation here in the U.S. So go ahead, take that away. Do what you will with that.
Well, the model that we've put forth references everything everyone on the panel is saying. That you have schools, under the community schools model, which is what we're looking for, you have spaces that young people would be able to find out and build on who they are and cultural strengths and language strengths and the things that they come in, community assets and things that go into the school with those young people so that they're empowered to go out into the world and be whole people interacting with jobs and things like that. I think what we're dealing with here is you have people who've had everything taken from them constantly and had doors closed in their faces. I mean, the incarceration rate here in Wisconsin is astronomical when you consider what percentage of the population Black and brown people make up. I think we're 6 to 12% of the population generally here in Wisconsin, but we are 50% plus of the prison population here. So I mean, we have to factor and be holistic in looking at all of the causes of where our people are and how we got here, and to know our way forward from that, and that these things all work together.
And speaking of working together, I just want to read another tweet. This is Mike Rich, who links those two things. He tweets in, "We can't talk about poverty without talking about institutional racism." And then behind it, hashtag still segregated. Yeah, I hear you. So Tracy, I want to go to you because we haven't heard from you in a bit, and I'm wondering how you think these things correlate, and then how then do we cover that?
Absolutely, and that's the perfect tweet to pull me in on, since Mike Rich is my colleague at CAP, so I'm sure he's laughing at home right now.
I promise I didn't know that, but
that
thank
was
you.
Not planned, so hi, Mike. But so yeah, we have to talk about institutionalized racism, because even if you do everything right, even if you're able to somehow get out of your neighborhood, go to college, and be on the job market, the truth of the matter is that a Black man who's looking for a job with no criminal record has a worse chance of getting a job than a white man with a criminal record. So there's a lot of things that are still going to be out of our hands, even if you're able to surpass these barriers. I wanted to build off of what Angela was saying about the consequences of the neighborhood still, is that if you're a low income child and you're growing up in, say, I'll use Baltimore because the children in Baltimore have the worst chances of escaping poverty than anywhere else in the country, that if you were even just moved to an average place as a child, by the time that child turns 26, they would make almost 30% more in their income. That was a study out of Harvard. So the ability for people to go past their station in life is incredibly hard. Barriers are stacked up against against us. And so I think what really needs to happen is we need intentional investments in our communities. We need intentional investments all along the way. It's in transportation, it's in housing, it's in the fact that the air we breathe has more pollution in it. Every aspect of our life has to have more investment from the federal government, because these are the legacies of federally sponsored racist programs. But also we have to ensure that the companies in our country are held accountable who are having discriminatory practices. So anyone who gets angry and thinks that, oh well, Black people are getting handouts and affirmative action is bad, that's the bare minimum.
And I know that there's someone on our panel who has a personal story that then elucidates what you were just saying. You mentioned Baltimore, and you mentioned really what I guess I would call environmental racism, or one could call environmental racism. Melina, you were telling our producers a story about why you had to take your kids out of the school system that you liked them in because of an environmental factor. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So there was an issue, if we think about how segregation, how racially and economically segregated communities are targeted for oppression. One of the examples that I gave is the rail system that's finally being brought into Los Angeles. And so my children went to an almost all Black school in South Los Angeles, but our mayor decided that we were going to push this rail system in. And what happened is the rail line, everywhere else it's a subway, right? But once it got to the heart of South Los Angeles, where Black folks, where working class and poor Black folks live, down Crenshaw at 48th, if anybody knows Los Angeles, it came up above the ground and was supposed to run along the street with the traffic. Now that is the most deadly form of rail system in the country, in the world, right? And so there's an example of it. They also have an above ground train in Watts, another economically depressed Black community, right? And so we have these situations where they are targeting our communities. They're saying our communities are disposable, that my children's lives do not matter as much as the children who live north of South Los Angeles, who live north of 48th, right? And so I had no choice but to say, I fought it as hard as I could. The parents at the school kind of joined with me. We tried to stop it. We went to the MTA meetings. We did everything we possibly could. In the end, we lost. And so then my question becomes, do I leave my children in a school that's really good for who they are? Or do I pull them out and put them in a school that's not as good, but is in a community that's safer? And so ultimately, I had to make the choice to pull my children out of that school and move them north so that they could be in a school that doesn't have a train running in front of it.
That is such a tough decision. Like, I'm trying to think, as you're talking, I was trying to think what I would do, and that's a hard decision, but I can understand exactly why you made that choice. Does anyone else have a story like that they think international community may not understand until they hear the actual "what would you do" scenario?
How many of our kids are going to schools that are built on top of Superfund sites?
Right.
Or that are in areas that, I know one of the problems that we've had here with charter and voucher schools moving in is that they can set up shop pretty much anywhere. And a lot of the places that they've set up shop here in Milwaukee are industrial areas that you would not think to send children into. That there was former manufacturing happened. Some of it should have been remediated, but you don't have any proof that it has been. Is it going to take 30 years, 40 years from now when these children who have been exposed to whatever's there get sick? Or these kids who are in these charter schools and voucher schools that have no playgrounds, that have no windows, none of these things. So, I mean, environmental justice and environmental racism are things that are very, very present considerations for our community, and I don't think they get enough airplay being concerned with Black and brown people. Not here.
Yeah, I just want to build off of that too, especially because we were talking a little bit about Hurricane Katrina at the top of this discussion. But I think, a lot of people think of hurricanes or big storms or floods as great equalizers, but they just exacerbate the underlying socioeconomic problems in our country. So the fact that you have, Black people have disproportionately shoddy housing, tend to live near Superfund sites or landfills or refineries. The fact that climate change is increasing, these weather events means that our communities are going to continue to be put in harm's way. And so it's really important that these conversations just don't crop up around the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, because the media coverage was great around the 10th anniversary, and then now no one, except luckily this Google Hangout, no one else is really talking about those issues anymore.
Well, and I think it's really important too. One thing that I think happens with segregation, it's a system we live inside of and we get really used to it, and I think it warps our brains to where we as marginalized people, be it in terms of race, class, gender, ethnic identity, immigrant status in this country, regardless of what it is, but if we are not the power, if we're not somebody who could have gone to Oxford in 1503, you know what I mean? Then it warps our brains too. And so we think of these issues as separated and segregated. But you cannot separate education from economics. You cannot separate that from racial justice. You cannot separate from that from the environment. If I look at New Orleans, the fact that we flooded the way we did because of federal mismanagement of our levees, and also because of an extraction industry that allowed for deterioration of our coastline, I can't separate that from the legacy of slavery and the legacy of colonialism. All of these things are attached, and we need to, as marginalized people and as allies of marginalized people, remember that those ideas are connected. They're not separated.
Right.
I want to wrap this part of the conversation up just with this last tweet, because this is from Russ, and he pretty much echoes what you all said. Russ writes in, "We are living in the fumes of segregation." So with that, we are pretty much out of time, but I do want to give you all a last word, and because I want you to come out of here feeling like you had your say and your fill, but of course if you didn't get a chance, you can keep tweeting us, and we're always open to your ideas, whether you're on Twitter, whether you're in this panel or this hangout with us right now. We really appreciate that. But I want to get a last sentence or two answer from each of you on either a do or a definitely do not do this when you cover these issues, because everyone always has something to say about the media. So here it is, the media, quote unquote, is trying to pick your brain on this to make sure we get this right. So I'll start with you, Angela.
I think if people are covering these issues, please see us as people. Please see us as families, not concepts, not ideas. We are people who are affected by the same changes and things, and we're not making these things up. They're documented. Institutional racism is not a figment of our imagination. It is not something that will simply go away if you choose not to see color. It doesn't work like that. So please, when we talk to you, I need you to hear us.
I love that. Thank you. I'm listening. Melina?
I think that one of the things I want to lift up, oftentimes we cover like issues, right? What is the current issue? I think the still segregated hashtag in this kind of conversation about racial segregation coupled with economic oppression is really important. And I want us to think about how to tie that in with key issues. So for instance, one of the things that we haven't talked about is the Black Lives Matter movement and state-sanctioned violence against Black people. We need to understand that the contemporary form of segregation that we experience allows for the state-sanctioned violence to exist. And so when we think about the killing of Mike Brown, when we think about the murder of Brother Africa on Skid Row, when we think about the killing of Riddell Jones in the jungles in Los Angeles, all of that it has a relationship to these larger questions of power and oppression. And so I think that it's really good to deal with these questions of power and oppression and then think about how that plays out in the lives and deaths of our people.
Beautifully said. Terry?
I think I often leave conversations like this feeling like I want to curl up into a ball and like cry because there's no hope.
Oh.
So I guess my last thing will be something that we can do. I think it's really important for media, but also for all of us as individuals when we enter into these conversations about identity and how we experience the world to position ourselves. It really matters, to my opinion, on this issue that I am a 29-year-old light-skinned black woman from New Orleans who's raising white passing mixed-race kids. All those things matter. And I think if all of us, when we entered into these conversations, put ourselves back into our body and stopped trying to pretend we were objective and actually came to terms with the fact that our point of view comes from our eyes, it comes from our bodies, then we could have these conversations a lot more responsibly and a lot more thoughtfully, and we could remember that we're people, all of us.
Tracy?
All right, so I want to echo the do that Melina pointed out about important conversations important conversations must include Black Lives Matter, and I want to really talk about, though, the flip side, the don't, which is please don't do any stories about black on black crime, because there's no such thing as black on black crime. It's just called crime. It's just called crime because white people kill white people, black people kill black people, and no one cares more about the deaths of black people by even other black people than we do. We care. We're, our communities march against this. There's these fictitious stories out there that nobody cares about deaths by black murderers. That's not true. We care about the deaths of black people no matter who the perpetrator is. And so please don't validate black on black crime as a concept, because it's just called crime. And so I want to end, though, more on a positive note and just say that I really loved being a part of this hangout, and that it really underscores my growing love of the hashtag Black Girl Magic, and I'm just happy to have participated in this.
Black Girl Magic, yes.
I'm going to use that hashtag once a week now. Thank you. All right, I want to thank all of our guests. Thank you to Terry Coleman, Angela Nicole Walker, Melina Abdullah, and Tracy Ross. Remember, this is not the end of the conversation. This is just the start of it. I know that sounds cheesy, but it's true. We want you to still keep these conversations going. We'll be monitoring the conversation on that hashtag Still Segregated. Of course, you can always use the hashtag AJStream to pitch us an idea. It's how we run. We run on the fumes of your ideas. So you can feel free to help shape our coverage, and that's exactly what this open editorial and the Twitter chat we did today will do for our future coverage. So look forward, stay tuned. You'll see that coming up, and we, of course, will let you know about it. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Malika Bilal, signing out.